Hello and welcome to What the Luxe with me, Fred Moore.
And me, Anand Sharma.
Together we lead Matter of Form, a design consultancy specialising in brand, digital experience and content. And this is a podcast that calls time on tired ideas of luxury.
Alongside industry luminaries and thought leaders, we explore what truly defines category-leading products and services. You make beautifully designed electric bikes, electric motorbikes, and clearly you have a passion for, vehicles. And talk to us about the inspiration and the opportunity that you saw that led to you starting Maeving. What was the journey that you went on when sort of turning it from a bit of a dream into something that, was a manufactured and commercially viable proposition? I can't imagine that that's that easy.
No, definitely. But it's worth sort of separating my love of cars and bikes growing up from actually the genesis of the business. Because, I think, honestly, I can't remember what age it was. I was 5 or something, and one of my mum's mates brought home a Jaguar XK and said, do you want to go for a little joyride? And I honestly, from that moment, got the bug. I used to have pictures from magazines all over my room of actually like max power custom cars, then went through the classic thing, fell in love with classic bikes as well. So there was that kind of backdrop of just loving driving, loving the physical kind of automobiles as well. But the genesis for Maeving actually came from me meeting my co-founder. He was going to become my co-founder at Durham University. So we became sort of best mates very quickly, and we decided after about 6 months that we were going to start a business together because we were very good at debating. We met in a philosophy tutorial. We were very good at debating, and we felt that we had this ability to kind of chew through challenging questions together that was quite conducive to working together in the future. But the only commitment that we made to each other at that stage was that the business would in some way be combating climate change, because that was what we both really cared about. And, ultimately, if you're going to devote your whole life and every ounce of your energy to starting a business, it's an added benefit if that can be something that contributes to a cause you care about. So we sort of, that was all we sort of agreed. And then fast forward, we also realized that we weren't going to be able to start a business just from scratch from uni. I don't know how anyone is able to do that. It takes a huge amount of determination, skill, confidence, all that kind of stuff. And you just don't, I think it's harder to have that straight out of uni. So we sort of went our separate ways in the commercial world first. So I went into sales and marketing, he went into finance. And the agreement was always that we were going to do that for about 5 years and then kind of quit and think about what sort of business that we wanted to start, as opposed to starting it from a job. Again, because if you're working sort of 60, 80-hour weeks, how the hell can you really devote time to a business? I think, look, a lot of people start businesses from a kind of position of they're either a kind of an inventor or they've worked in a particular industry for a long period of time and they've spotted a gap and they can kind of take their skill set and directly plant it into a new business that, their own invention. But plenty of businesses start, I guess, like ours, where it's more research driven. You kind of, that you want to start a business, but you're not quite, as you sort of say there, you're not quite sure how or where. I mean, when we quit our jobs, began looking at, I guess, climate change, the various sectors contributing to carbon emissions, and transport. The electrification of transport is a pretty obvious one. I think particularly for two people who have not a single technical bone in their body, we were never going to be solving problems like, air travel, concrete production, carbon sequestering, really big, that's going to require people who are a lot smarter than us to solve those problems. But the electrification of transport was quite tangible. And very quickly we discovered within that, it seems odd saying it now because everyone's talking about China, but back in 2017, 2018, when we were thinking about starting the business, no one was really looking at China in terms of electric adoption. People were talking about Norway. They just passed 50%, new vehicle purchases. But China had this crazy high adoption rate. It was like 80%. And it was all down to 2-wheeled vehicles in urban areas. Long story short, it was because it's a way of getting around the charging infrastructure challenge and the range anxiety challenge. They were just using removable batteries in their 2-wheelers. Sounds like a really simple problem. The idea that you can have an EV that can take you, 80 miles, let's say, 50 miles, 80 miles, 100 miles, but have a battery that you can take out and charge as easily as a phone or a laptop was completely revolutionary to us. given that everyone was grumbling about charging infrastructure. And so that was the thing that got us interested in the two-wheel space.
And it's small, but really, it's a really key thing. It's being able to take the battery out of my e-bike and put it in my living room and charge it up, or wherever I end up, it's just completely changes how you think about range.
There's all sorts of, hoovers where it makes sense, but yeah, the idea that you could do that in a slightly more sort of substantial EV was pretty crazy for us. And we spent some time out in Shanghai where people, get home after a week worth of commuting and they're just taking their battery out, like a rucksack or something, and they just sort of take it into their apartments or a cafe or at work.
Can I ask you a question? Because I feel in the world today, there's a lot of support if you want to start a tech business or a digital business. There's a lot of buzz and hype, and VCs are very interested in businesses that exist in certain spaces. What are the steps someone might take if they have an audacious idea to sort of make electric motorbikes? What was the journey you went on?
Yeah, I can only really comment on the way that we went about it, which is probably not the right way. I mean, it's I have no idea. Again, if you at the time had an engineer on our team, it maybe would have been different. But the way that we went about it, so just quickly for a bit of context. So we looked at what was going on in China, and we originally thought about importing a bike, but basically stepped away from that because the bikes in China at the time were made to a very strict price ceiling and didn't have the quality that we were looking for. And Britain has a very established, tradition, heritage in the world of motorcycle design. So eventually we decided, right, we're going to start an automotive company ourselves. We're going to champion removable batteries, but we are going to lean into this rich heritage. And so we were then we've got to design our first bike, our first prototype from scratch. And so the way that we went about it was that I started just purely because I used to be an artist. I got an art scholarship to my school. I could use a pencil. I began doing some concept sketches, some very simple kind of 2D stuff based on bikes that I loved from the kind of great eras of motorcycle design. British motorcycle design, kind of 1920s, 1960s, 70s, the cafe racer era. This is like James Dean, Steve McQueen kind of thing, mods and rockers. And my co-founder started learning a little bit about kind of electric powertrains. So started speccing a battery motor. And then we basically put together a concept pack that we took to a industrial design company who were absolutely fantastic and basically worked as an outsourced engineering team for us in the early stage, and we just worked through to developing what was called a looks like prototype. So kind of early stage concept bike, which works, which looks like the thing that we then went on to design, but ultimately is not built to the same standard. It's missing sort of 70% of the components internally, but you get a good idea for the bike. And it was that we used to then go on a kind of funding roadshow to get our initial VC interest.
How do you navigate the balance of form and function when you're designing something like a motorbike that starts with a sketch that takes cues from, eras where you have to think about combustion, you have to think about perhaps things in a slightly different way. And I've maybe like the Jaguar Land Rover, like probably quite interesting example right now of just like sort of, basically redesigning something, but maybe without having to consider some of the constraints that led to the beauty of the design. And are we now emulating the beauty of something born of different constraints or like?
Yeah, totally. And actually the JLR example is an interesting one because arguably they've stuck in many ways with the traditional car shape. They've got that long bonnet and there was some people who were calling for them to reimagine the electric car in a slightly more developed way. I think it's an interesting looking car for what it's worth. I'm not one of the haters. I think that no one likes change, and for them to kind of come in and reshape that brand, a much loved heritage brand, is bold. So
There's some such ridiculous hate about the redesign that there are people sort of saying, yeah, it sort of doesn't really look like the car's real, will it drive? And it's like, they've got quite a lot of engineering expertise. And actually, what used to be combustion is now a battery and a body kit. I think they're going to be able to make the car go.
I think they're going to be okay. Look, ever since they brought out the F-Type and the whole sort of reinvent, I think they're great. We're their neighbours, by the way. They're right next to us in Coventry. Great sort of example of the heritage in that region.
I think there's a heritage of British design and a heritage in that business that people were afraid to see being let go of. And I think it's sort of almost quite intrinsic to like the fabric of like what makes the design ethos of this country kind of great. And I think that what they did, and I'm more 50-50 on the execution of the campaign around this, but they tried to look at the founding spirit and then reimagine the future based on that founding spirit, which I think is an important thing to think of rather than just resting on history and heritage. I think you need to go back to like the founding spirit, and I'll never forget doing some work for Bugatti years ago, and you look at the archives and people like Ettore Bugatti, they were like deeply nuanced. He was just all about making cars to go, not to stop, which is what he told someone when they returned their car because the brakes failed. And it's like sort of, it's just this sort of audaciousness,
Yeah.
And when things then get adopted by the super wealthy as a status symbol, and the R&D and the audaciousness gets operationalized and turned into a business, it's very, it's hard to be as brave and confident and to retain that spirit. And I think that's the real challenge for a lot of luxury brands. They started as innovators.
Yeah, totally. No, couldn't agree more. I also, it's worth saying, I kind of my comment is almost irrespective of how one feels about that new car concept, just the instant, determination to dislike a divergence from that seeming tradition, but as you say, going right back to the roots. It's just a bit of a shame. You're also making me think about how, it's one of the things that we thought about with our bikes is we want them to reference heritage cues and to have design language from these great eras of British motorcycle design. But we don't want anyone to look at our bikes and go, that's just a sort of replica of a bike that we recognise from the 60s.
That's kind of what I was getting at, the balance of sort of just aestheticism, because that's how a motorbike ought to look. But obviously, the drive, like everything about it's changed. Yeah. It's now battery driven, and so how much variance was there in your concepts before you decided what the right path was and how it should look?
If you look back at all of the kind of concept development that we did, it did retain a relatively classic form. We weren't going to completely reinvent the wheel when it came to like the structure of the frame. We were trying to go for that sort of simple elegance from these particular eras of British motorcycle design. But it's also worth saying that you're a lot more constrained on a two-wheeler than you are on a car. You've ultimately got something which has to be light. It's got to fit between someone's legs. There are limitations in terms of how long it can be. You'd be amazed at how quickly you end up with something that looks ostensibly like a motorcycle, from when motorcycles were first devised in the late 19th century. And so it wasn't too much of a struggle, how do we move away from what's gone before versus how do we retain certain cues? It all came together in a relatively sort of frictionless manner, I'd say.
When you were building the business, how did you think about the other aspects other than the point of sale, the showroom, the distribution network, it's what Tesla famously sort of did, just sort of own the whole experience end to end. What were the conversations you had around that, servicing, all these types of things?
Well, I think we went down I don't really want to say the Tesla route, but we're the first direct-to-consumer motorcycle manufacturer in the world as far as I'm aware, certainly in Europe. And I think that's just very simply because if you can own the whole customer journey, then you're solely in charge of how good that experience is. And that is, I think, both crucial from a kind of premium brand and anyone who wants to develop real brand loyalty. But also, I think just if you were to start from scratch and you think about the kind of purchase journey of a car or a bike, in this day and age, you would choose a direct model. People would rather have something delivered to their door and serviced at their doorstep instead of going to a random dealership in the middle of nowhere. I think that it's no surprise that the legacy model is one of, dealerships and distributors, because that's, is devised in a pre-internet era. But when you can completely configure something bespoke online and have it delivered and have that connection with the manufacturer, I think that's a way better experience. And I think our customers definitely benefit from having that direct link.
Do you think most companies, if they could own the whole experience end to end, would do far better for it? I think
they would choose to now. I think starting from scratch. But if you have a huge legacy,
they're hooked on the dealership networks. Basically, there's a codependence there.
Yes, and also, it's interesting. There's also an element of if you've been in the market for a while and your customer base is used to going to certain dealerships, then it's, there's more of a reason to retain that model. But if you're creating a new product and you've got different customers, they're not shopping in the kind of legacy models.
Did you do much kind of customer insight work to validate what you were about to do? Did it feel fairly obvious?
That one felt fairly obvious to us. I've got to be honest. I think we were very much asking ourselves what would be the service that we would want. And, if you look online at kind of complaints around particular manufacturers, that, a lot of it is about the disconnect between them having to have a relationship with a particular dealership, not with the actual, manufacturer.
Well, I meant for the bike itself as well, because are you transforming commuters into motorbikers, or are you transforming petrol heads into electric heads? Or obviously a bit of both.
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. And I think the thing that we were surprised about was, in a way, was the traditional motorcyclists.
Because they're quite enthusiastic,
They are. And a lot of them are very wedded to petrol as well.
We talk about philosophy and the meditative qualities of, you only have to read Zen in the Art of Motorbike Maintenance, which is a wonderful, wonderful book, isn't it? To just know that it's the joy of putting the engine on the kitchen table, I think, as it's been referred to, is where a lot of it's the journey, it's the process, it's the maintenance of the thing that gives people quite a lot of pleasure, that I think people feel a bit of a loss for when...
Definitely. And it's also worth saying, I am I'm an old school petrol head as well. I do love, I don't love what the combustion engine has done for the planet, but I love it from an engineering perspective and from a kind of, feel and, indulgence. I mean, I still have a classic bike. I still drive a petrol car because I do a lot of driving and I, you do need the range. But I ride an electric motorbike in town now, obviously one of our bikes. And
what car have you got? Have you got a zany car? Or?
I've got a Mazda MX-5, which I would bore you for hours as being one of the funnest cars you can possibly drive and own, but I won't. There's a whole, as you probably know, there's a whole cult around MX-5s, which, I always wanted a little two-seater convertible, and we'll be interested to see when Mazda makes the switch to their electric version. But yeah, so I totally sympathise with the kind of fascination around combustion engines and some of the enjoyment that comes from the kind of the rumble, the noise, but I think that there's different enjoyments that you can get from an electric powertrain.
Well, the silence presumably is one of them. We're so coded to associate power with the sound of an engine. I love the sound of an engine, personally. I'm like sort of unnecessarily revving my motorbike the whole time. I'm one of those idiots, who not obviously in sort of crowd said, but just my own personal satisfaction, like as gliding through the mountains. For me, it's a great joy. But presumably, like when you're in those situations, it must be an amazing feeling to just gliding through.
Precisely. And it's a completely unique, enjoyment. It's so different. The way that there's just, you're not going through the gears, you're just kind of pulling away and you're just accelerating and gliding. And it's really interesting. We have, and this actually came from our brand ambassadors, more as an insight than it came from us, was when there's a couple of people that we've been shooting some short films with this year. Ashley Walters, I don't know if you watched Top Boy, but the sort of Top Boy lead actor who was GQ Man of the Year last year, and then a guy called Tom Brown, who's a celebrity Michelin star chef, and they both are passionate riders of our bikes, and we did short films with them about their lives, but they obviously riding the bikes.
I bet after a day in the kitchen, the silence is probably quite nice.
Precisely, that's it. So this guy Tom has a hugely frenetic life, working in a high pressure kitchen. Working late hours. It's constant sort of noise of people ordering and people chopping things around you. And the interesting thing, and the same with Ashley, he's a actor, but he's also a director. Everything he does, and he's quite introverted. He's despite his online persona, he's quite a quiet guy, and both of those people, for them, putting on their helmet, bear in mind they can't be recognized when they're in their helmet, and going out and just having this kind of silent ride at the end of the day, it's like their therapy, is the way that Tom describes it. And one of the things that I've realized, one of the things that got me into biking was I kind of, my mum had always been like, please just never buy a motorbike. And I eventually made the excuse, and the excuse that I came up with was the amount of time it would save me on my commute to Slough when I was working in this FMCG commercial role. But the thing that I wasn't ready for was
You're commuting from London to Slough.
from London to Slough, right? This is like cycling to Paddington, train to Slough, company shuttle bus. It's like an hour and a half. And I saved 26 days a year in commuting time by switching to a bike. But the thing that I wasn't ready for was how every morning the alarm would go off and I would be like, oh, and then I'd be like, oh, I get to ride my bike. I mean, every day. Food is the same for me. I enjoy every meal, despite the fact that you have 3 meals a day.
Lime bikes are just one of those amazing, I know they're not always perfect and some of them are a bit bumped
Oh,
around.
they're great, amazing.
But honestly, I get on
They're
them.
fantastic.
There's certain things like Shazam and Lime bikes are 2 things where like whenever I use them, I'm like, this is such magic.
It is, and I would always, from a kind of climate change perspective, but also just from a consumer perspective, they're great. I'm very pleased they exist, and I think there's lots of instances where it makes sense to just solely use those.
But there are also some nutty like the world is so obsessed with things like health and safety, but then there's certain instances where it seems okay to get on a Lime bike without a helmet to cycle home after going for drinks in London. And
Or get coming out of a club at 3 a.m.
and it's like perfectly legal. It's like, and just leave your bike on the pavement. It's like, it's so odd how we can be so regulated in certain ways, and then there's just some things just seem to be like normalized and fine. Why Coventry?
Coventry. Look, I mean, Coventry is the birthplace of British motorcycling. So the Excelsior, I think it was the Excelsior Motor Company put out their first production bike there in 1896, something like that. And since then, it's been kind of the home of motorcycling and automotive. So we specifically went there because Triumph was just down the road, and a lot of our team, including our head of product, come from Triumph. So we have our head of product is Triumph's former head of product. And they're just the most experienced and beautiful motorcycle company. But it is a place that is dripping in heritage and kind of a little bit like Detroit. It's not a pretty place, and you would, if you're sort of just driving down any street in the suburbs or the kind of industrial bit, you wouldn't know the magic that was behind any particular gate. But there are the suppliers and the manufacturers that are, as I said, just around the corner from Jaguar Land Rover. We got Polestar, we've got Ola, the fastest growing Indian electric two-wheeler company. It's just all in this very small area, and so it was completely the obvious place for us to go.
It's kind of becoming rarer and rarer, isn't it, for places to have an association with industries?
Yeah.
And to just have that IP, that sort of IP that exists almost like within households, within families, within...
Completely. It's like the golden triangle for Formula One. I mean, it's just this extraordinary... Yeah. But the weird thing, I think, for us, is, I mean, the UK is not really renowned for much anymore. Maybe financial services, but certainly not manufacturing.
Financial services industry that services other countries well. It's a little bit depressing. But design, we should be doubling down as a country on being a centre of creative excellence and having more faith in the taste making that is so evident in so many things we've done in the past and continue to do currently, and stand against the commodification of many industries by providing taste, style, marrying sort of like history with like this sort of strong sense of like culture and heritage, and using it as a lens on the future.
I really like that. I like the sort of the taste making analogy, because I think that's exactly what the UK continues to do with motorbikes. I mean, you've obviously got the big bike building nations like sort of Japan and actually India and China, but the people still revere British motorcycles and the design and brands like Triumph and BSA, which is now being resurrected, and Norton, they Royal Enfield, they hold a real sort of strong place in people's hearts. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's why we decided to kind of lean into that.
What will they do? Will they all electrify? Are they electrifying?
It'll take a while. No, they're dragging their heels, and that's completely understandable. I'll explain why. But no, I think the direction of travel is clearly to electric.
Well, surely it's because you have to fire half your staff.
Well, no. The challenge with bikes versus cars is that with a car you can energy density in batteries is about half that of fuel density, and in cars that's okay. You can have just hundreds of cells, and it doesn't matter that the car weighs 2.5 tons because it goes 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, and you don't really feel the weight. But on a bike, you're limited in terms of the weight of the vehicle and the footprint of the vehicle. So at the moment, you can't really make a full power recreational motorcycle of the sort that Harley make or Triumph make and have built their brand equity around. Where electric makes complete sense, and this is why we've started Maeving and why we're focusing on the kind of slightly lower power commuter segment, is in 125cc, 200cc style bikes where you can have a battery that is small enough that you can take it out and charge it remotely. Because then you get round, then you don't have a bike that goes 100 miles and then you need to plug it in. You have a bike that goes 80 miles, so it gives you easily a week's worth of commuting, but you can just charge it at any standard socket. So you sort of take away that barrier to electric adoption in the form of charging infrastructure. So it's understanding that the companies that have, that generally make higher power recreational bikes are really struggling with the move to electric, because it's just, you can't really do it at the moment.
I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room, actually, with all of these kind of like mechanical industries. You've got 1,000 parts and a lot of expertise being replaced with a battery and something that you might choose to call styling. What does that mean for organizations who are substantial in size?
So first of all, yes, you will. Anyone who is, their particular expertise is like, I don't know, crankshafts or just combustion engines. Let's call it high performance combustion engines. That is obviously something that is going to need to change, and that person's going to need to develop their career. But there's still, there's still gearboxes. There's lots of analogous parts, which would mean that someone who is an experienced engineer in one field can easily move to an adjacent sort of area of the design and build. But I think it's a bit of a fallacy to say that electric motors are just really simple, and so that just gives you the challenge of making them bigger and better and introducing new technologies that harness their power in different ways. And so whilst there are less components on our bike versus the comparable motorcycle in the combustion world, there's all sorts of innovations that are making them, complex and kind of pushing the envelope. So I don't think it's, all those skilled engineers are going to have new jobs in a new arena.
As a business that 5 years ago was a startup?
We founded the company in 2018.
Sorry, that's longer than 7 years, 8 years, yeah. How did you market yourself, and how did you just go about the other side of the equation? How did you go about building awareness? How did you go about sort of getting people to invest in a big ticket item, in something that's not, an everyday spend?
Well, I think the crucial thing for us, even in a world in which you're selling to new riders who are not the traditional motorcycle customer, the key thing was to get the seal of approval from the motorcycle kind of fraternity and the experts. So for us, the first port of call was getting our products into the hands of the old school trade reviewers, who are the real motorcycle experts, and making sure that they actually thought it was a really good product. Because even if you have no interest in the world of petrol bikes, you're still going to Google, Maeving review, and it's really important that you see good reviews from people whose opinions you respect. So that was the first kind of nail-biting exercise, was sending out a new small electric motorbike or low-capacity electric motorbike so in the UK it's like MCN is a good example. Motorcycle News is like the oldest and most respected trade reviewer, and there's a world in which they could have gone out to a load of crap. It's electric, whatever. And it was the opposite. They came back and were incredibly. I would argue that our bikes are the best reviewed electric motorbikes in the world. And last year, MCN gave us the industry award for the best urban electric motorbike. So this is sort of ahead of Kawasaki, BMW, who launched similar sort of products aiming at a similar market at the same time as we launched our last bike.
Feels like you've created quite an iconic silhouette.
I like to think so. Look, two of the most respected trade reviewers said they had not had as much attention on any other bike as they did on our bike. So I do think that the design is beautiful.
What are your learnings? What if you were to advise an entrepreneur today who wanted to start OEM business?
So much advice. It would be to hire the most experienced engineers. I think that there is the common sort of conception of a startup is the kind of Silicon Valley, 22-year-olds on a beanbag kind of thing. And that is not how you go about starting an automotive company. You need people who have been there, done that, and designed motorbikes or cars or whatever it might be for, years and years and years. And so when we originally came back from China and we saw what, I suppose, poor quality can do and the risks associated with poor quality, I'm not saying that Chinese products are generally of poor quality, just that it so happens that because the price ceiling is so low, a lot of those cheap Chinese scooters are not very good quality. And we by contrast, were like, right, no, we want to focus on quality. We want to make bikes that last. We want to make bikes that are, respected. The look and feel is good. And so our first hire was, arguably the most qualified person in the country and one of the most qualified European product leads. A guy who'd spent the last 25 years bringing bikes from concept to market success. And then, until relatively recently, the least experienced engineer in our team was sort of 17 years of experience.
Was it a hard sale getting people to, did people see that the tides are shifting?
I think there's definitely a sense of if you want to be designing motorbikes for the rest of your life and the trajectory of travel is towards electric, then you want to be with the companies that are making that switch. But look, I think there's an element of dominoes. Once we got this guy Graham involved, that he sort of brought over an initial kind of crack team, then it's become easier and easier to recruit.
When you're designing these bikes, what's the type of emotion that you're looking to solicit?
Gosh, look. Well, I mean, you were kind of using the term glide. I mean, I quite like the British understatement thing. I don't think our bikes are not ostentatious. I think they're just, the look and feel gives you a sense of pride, and when you're riding them, it's a kind of, it's that gliding sensation. It's kind of elegance. It's that's the sphere I think we're in.
Do you think they're luxury? What does luxury mean to you?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Again, actually, just on that sort of trend, that theme of understatement, I think luxury is about beautiful design. It's about heritage. It's about good quality materials. It's about reliability. For me, it's a lot about having something which you might not spot it, a mile away, but it just is made of amazing materials. It's going to last. It's going to make you feel pride every time you put it on.
I think a luxury is also how you frame something, isn't it? And I think what's interesting is you're inspired by low-cost electric scooters in China, and we've spoken about, those who aspire to have low-cost cars in India who once drove scooters. And here we are trying to turn the journey of it all into something that is more delightful and feels like a greater luxury than, nestling into the armpit of a man in a carriage with a tube, and that feels like a great luxury.
No, definitely. But look, there are specific things there as well. I mean, if you look at the electrification of transport, the temptation is to make something that is really futuristic looking. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not what people like about bikes. They like the naked, what's called the sort of naked motorcycle design, where you have exposed metalwork, you have everything is good to touch. And so that was a real focus for us, was not having lots of kind of injection molded plastic, having a steel frame, having, beautiful painted tanks, stitched seats, metal central housings, all of that stuff, spoke wheels, things that are tangible and give you a sense of satisfaction.
What are your non-negotiables as a business? What were you like? These are our mandates when we're building out our business and our product.
I think that we want our bike. So Maeving, the name comes from the word maven, which means kind of a thought leader, a connoisseur, an expert, a leader. We want our design to always stand out amongst peers, so people to always choose our bikes based on their design. We have a mantra: every customer is a VIP. We want everyone to feel like they're being treated like the member of a club, and feel like they're part of something. So customer centricity, beautiful design, and then progress. Ultimately, I mean, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to reimagine motorcycling. Zero emissions, it being more inclusive culture. There not being this kind of really niche idea of who a motorcyclist is and who isn't welcome into the tribe.
Do you do sort of experiential things to activate that sort of sense of membership that you spoke about?
Look, not as much as we should. It's something we want to do more of, but we despite having that kind of direct, mainly online business, we have showrooms that act as kind of physical touch points for the brand, and where people have, can feel the experience of going in and having a kind of consultation test rides. Exactly.
So when someone orders something online, it gets delivered to their house, and then is there some sort of ceremony or ritual, or is there any education, or is it literally like DHL turn up?
No. It's absolutely not DHL. No, and people love. I mean, that moment of sort of checking your watch to see when your new car or bike's going to arrive. No, I mean, a Maeving van turns up, and you have someone on. It's not in a box. It's sort of wheeled off the back, and you then have one of our team who will sort of talk you through how it works and show you your owner's manual and get it usually takes about an hour.
Okay, right, yeah, so it's really assisted.
Yeah, and it's don't get me wrong, we're not talking sort of McLaren special operations, light tunnel.
Yeah, but nor is at IKEA,
No, but that joy of a real enthusiast, sort of talking through your new bike is.
And so when you're looking at your target market, I mean, I guess we were talking about this before we started recording, but for me, it would seem that there's a very clear target market in and around cities, and unlocking the opportunity to go and live in suburban areas that are perhaps less well connected, or just giving people more freedom to pick where they want to live without having to think about necessarily the journeys or interchanges required to get to the office, which obviously is slightly less important now anyway, but. Do you think about it like that? Do you pick like key hotspots and then develop sort of hyperlocal marketing strategies to try and warm people into the concept of what it might mean to be someone who commutes on a motorbike?
I think it's self-selecting. I think as you've sort of identified, the bikes are geared towards urban riding, and that's where it makes the most sense, because you do get like an entire week's worth of commuting, and that's where also the contrast of like the busy tube versus the ease of riding a bike is so clear. Whereas in the countryside, suburbia, people are more used to using cars, and it's a little bit less congested. So those clusters develop. And then naturally the marketing becomes a little bit more focused on those areas. And it certainly is geared towards urban riding, but that's very, in the US, in California, people are using the bikes in a completely different way. They're using them on the sort of, in the glorious sun on the weekend to go to the beach. It's not that the sort of the drudgery of the commute that's the main focus that they're trying to overcome. It's a much more open, recreational, optimistic message.
Can I ask two really stupid questions? The first is to satisfy my own curiosity. They make no noise.
No, or virtually no noise.
Is that dangerous for the rider in terms of signalling to others that you're sort of approaching on a fairly precarious two-wheeled?
Look, this is a really hotly contested debate, and of which existing motorcyclists are very passionate about. There's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that it's a fallacy, the kind of, loud bikes save lives things. No, loud pipes save lives. I can't remember what the mantra is, but no, look, I would argue, so a few things. One is that when things are quiet, you can hear more of what's going on around you. So you're more aware of your environment. You also, the notion that someone, that revving a bike, that people in modern cars can really hear that, I think is a bit of a fallacy. It's better to ride in a way where you don't rely on the revving of your bike for safety. I mean, just ride sensibly. But also it's worth saying that countries that have really adopted electric, people are much more cognizant when they're crossing the road. You don't just sort of walk across the road assuming that you're going to hear a vehicle coming. And already, since the Prius hit the road, but I'm sure that 10, 12 years ago, there was a bit of debate about these silent Priuses. People adapt, people evolve. We've all had that experience of being woken up at 5 a.m. by a sort of someone revving a, small bike. It's really unpleasant. But by contrast, when you're in Shanghai and you've got, the lights go green and 10,000 quiet bikes just glide away, I would argue that is a better city experience. One that has clean air, no noise, it's much more peaceful.
We have Automobilia Pininfarina on this podcast in a couple of episodes. We have a little cluster around automotive. These guys make the Batmobile. It's just so cool. I don't know if it slightly undermines it, the fact that it's linked to a movie or a comic, or if it would just be better if it was just a design that wasn't necessarily linked to the Batmobile, but it looks amazing. Did you ever consider building something that looks more like sort of, Bruce Wayne's...
Yeah, he's Blade Runner kind of vibe. No, we didn't. We very...
massive tyres, do you know what I mean? Just totally different.
Look, we very specifically didn't do that because of Britain's heritage. in motorcycle design. It just, I think we feel that the thing that people love about bikes, that people don't want to lose that heritage, design. And so
I always think these things are fascinating though. It's like, do you recreate codes that were, like was what we were talking about earlier about, it's constraint that breeds beauty. Do you know what I mean? But when those constraints change, do you then emulate a past glory, or do you look at the constraints that exist today and push boundaries in different ways and build new codes that people start associating with, create positive associations with? And sound is one of those that's like, for example,
look, there's room for everyone out there, I guess. There's room for, there are parts of I love design more generally, and increasingly I'm drawn towards, if we just think about interiors, more modern interior design. But in terms of watches, I love classic watches. I like dress watches. I just think there's arenas in which people have more of a engagement with heritage or with classic design, and arenas in which people are more interested in modern reinvention. And it just so happens that I've grown up in a country that is revered for a heritage style that I love and have loved since I was a little kid. So I think that as we develop our product range, we'll push the envelope in certain respects. I don't think our bikes will always be, I think there's room for us to have a kind of heritage roadster segment, and then bikes which are a little bit more modern, particularly more performance orientated bikes. But yeah, I can't deny that I love everything that's gone before.
What would you change about the industry if you could change one thing tomorrow?
It's just the fact it's so male dominated. It is. I think it's 91% male riders in this country. I mean, that's crazy as a category. And obviously bikes, can be used by everyone and should be used by everyone and enjoyed equally. And I think part of that's down to a lot of the brand equity in the advertising that's gone before. A lot of it's down to physical constraints as well of bikes, too high seats and very heavy and all that kind of stuff. And similarly in the engineering world, you can probably count the number of female motorcycle engineers on your fingers. So that I think is something that needs to change if we're to get more female riders into the game.
Sustainability was a key driver to build the business that you've built today. What other concerns, because that is a concern, the sustainability of things and our planet, what other concerns do you have about the world that we're leaving the next generation?
Oh gosh, other than climate change. Look, I mean, the climate change one is a big one, and it seems to be something that people continually are happy to sort of sideline.
It's being massively sidelined at the moment. It's unbelievable what's going on.
People are really reluctant to accept that they might have to make compromises to save the planet. It's too big for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But look, it's a huge one. I can't say it enough. I'm increasingly bothered by the information and the misinformation landscape. I think that's something that I'm nervous about in terms of the next generation. Is we can remember when we were taught at school how to kind of spot the truth in a versus bias in mainstream newspapers, but the assumption was always that the truth existed and that there was a kernel that you could get to there, but a world in which you've got sort of
I totally agree. I think that's one of the greatest issues that we're all going to face with our kids and their children, especially with deep fakes and things like this. It's just so difficult to detangle the truth and things that are synthesized. But I also think there's a bit of a case of history always being written by the winners, and there are maybe more opaque forms of there are more opaque veneers. I don't even know if that's an expression that works, but you know what I mean. There's a lot of bias that's impacted how we've remembered and thought about things that there's less obvious.
And I wouldn't deny that, but I suppose we can look forward to a lot more of that going forward in a world the truth becomes more and more opaque.
If you had to give up what you're doing tomorrow, and come on, every entrepreneur's fantasized about this when having a difficult moment, what would you do?
I think I'd probably give a much more mundane answer than a lot of people. I think I would I'd retrain and become a therapist. I would produce music, and I would surf every day.
They're almost the same as what I'd say. When I'm having particularly bad times, I'm always like, I just need to do something with my hands,
Yeah, I know, I do. I really miss that. But it's interesting. I'm such a strong extrovert, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs, or a lot of people look at entrepreneurs, would assume that they would be serial entrepreneurs and they would just always be doing something kind of big and generalist and starting businesses. But I seem to crave to kind of go back to a slightly more, individual and quiet and peaceful existence, I think. But maybe that's inevitable if you're in a busy business.
And then lastly, what's the thing that most excites you about the next 5 years?
Another mundane answer. My wife and I think about having kids, and which is probably going to be more stressful than starting a business. But yeah, pretty exciting.
Good luck getting time on your motorbike after that.
Yeah. I don't know how you manage kids and a business, and particularly when one's in Coventry and the other's in London. But we'll see.
I think the key is, if you are thinking of having kids and have an interest in motorbiking, to buy the motorbike before you have children.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been What the Luxe. You can find us on socials at Matter of Form, and drop us any questions or comments on Twitter using the hashtag #WhatTheLuxe. Or if you're a luxury brand looking for strategy and design that goes beyond the banal, get in touch via hello@matterofform.com and chat to one of our consultants.